He looked from my chart to my face, and then he laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was short, dismissive, a puff of air that invalidated months of my suffering. "It's just stress," he said, his pen already moving to the prescription pad. "You need to relax." He was wrong. So profoundly wrong that, months later, the hospital's automated system would inform him that I was dead. It was only then, seeing my name on his list of deceased patients, that he finally began searching for the truth. This is the story of how I had to die for a doctor to finally save my life. Before the pain, my life was a symphony of carefully arranged notes, all playing in perfect harmony. My 30s were a time of vibrant momentum, defined by the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement during sunrise runs, the air crisp and full of promise. My career was a challenging crescendo, demanding my focus and rewarding my effort. My evenings were filled with the soft melodies of friendship, the clinking of wine glasses, the comfortable murmur of shared stories, the easy laughter that felt like the most natural thing in the world. I was the architect of this life, and I believed, with a quiet and foolish pride, that I was in complete control of the composition. In this well-ordered world, my body was my most trusted instrument, always performing as expected. I fueled it with kale and quinoa, tested its limits at the gym, and rewarded it with 8 hours of sleep. Sickness was an abstract concept, a dramatic storyline for other people. I saw it on the news, I heard about it from distant relatives, but it felt as removed from my reality as a foreign film. My own mortality was a whisper so faint I couldn't even hear it. I was healthy because I worked at it, and I believed that effort was a shield against the chaos I saw buffet the lives of others. My own strength felt absolute and permanent. The world I had built was tactile and rich with sensation. It was the comforting weight of my dog's head in my lap as I read on a rainy afternoon, the invigorating scent of dark roast coffee that signaled the start of a productive day, and the warmth of my partner's hand in mine as we walked through the city park. Life was a series of predictable, pleasant sensory inputs. I took for granted the simple, profound peace of a body that did not hurt, of a mind that was not preoccupied with a silent, internal alarm. Everything was exactly as it should be, a testament to planning and good choices. Then, one Tuesday, the symphony faltered. It was a single, discordant note. While reaching for a book on a high shelf, a strange twinge, sharp and unfamiliar, radiated from my abdomen. It was there and gone in a second, a flicker of static in an otherwise clear broadcast. I dismissed it instantly. A pulled muscle, a weird cramp. It was nothing. But even as I turned the page of my book, a tiny, cold splinter of unease had lodged itself in my mind. It was the first time my body had sent a signal I did not understand, a message in a language I had never heard before. Weeks later, the signal returned, no longer a fleeting twinge, but a persistent, unwelcome broadcast. It settled in as a dull, gnawing ache deep within me, a phantom I couldn't locate but could never ignore. I was in the middle of presenting quarterly projections to my team when it bloomed, a sickening pressure that stole my breath. I excused myself, my voice tighter than I wanted, and fled to the sterile silence of the office bathroom. Leaning over the sink, I saw a stranger's face in the mirror pale, with a new tension around the eyes. The pain was an invisible passenger, and it was starting to take the wheel. My logical mind scrambled for explanations, offering up a menu of benign possibilities. It was the spicy lunch from yesterday. It was premenstrual cramps, though my cycle wasn't due for 2 weeks. It was poor posture from sitting at my desk all day. I clung to these rationalizations like a life raft, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. For the first time, my body felt less like a home, and more like a house with a stranger hiding in the walls. The sense of betrayal was profound. This vessel, which I had curated with such care, was now staging a quiet, painful rebellion. The cold porcelain of the sink did little to soothe my clammy hands. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to amplify the anxious thrumming in my chest. I took deep, shaky breaths, trying to pinpoint the epicenter of the pain, but it was evasive, a dull fire that shifted and moved with a will of its own. My reflection offered no answers, only showing me the first visible cracks in the facade of the woman who always had everything under control. I splashed cold water on my face, straightened my blouse, and walked back to the meeting, the invisible passenger now seated right beside me. That night, sleep offered no escape. The pain, which had been a dull ache, sharpened into a vicious pulse that jolted me awake just after 3 a.m. The flimsy comfort of my rationalizations dissolved in the dark. This was not indigestion. This was not a pulled muscle. This was something else, something new and wrong. The quiet of my bedroom became a vacuum, filled only by the sound of my own anxious breathing and the relentless, internal throb. The question was no longer what it was, but how long I could pretend it was nothing. My browser history became a roadmap of my escalating fear. I started with innocent searches like abdominal pain causes, and quickly descended into the terrifying rabbit hole of online symptom checkers. Each click led me down a darker path, from inflammatory bowel disease to rare forms of cancer. The blue light of my laptop screen at 2 in the morning became my tormentor, feeding me worst-case scenarios and patient forums filled with horror stories. My vibrant, real world was shrinking, replaced by this shadowy digital space of illness and dread. The woman who ran in the park and laughed with friends was disappearing, replaced by a ghost who haunted her own life. The pain was a constant companion, a low-level static that made it impossible to concentrate. At work, my focus fractured. With friends, my laughter felt forced, a hollow echo of what it once was. The fear was a poison seeping into everything, turning my natural optimism into a brittle, anxious pessimism. I felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone, trapped inside a body that was turning against me for reasons I couldn't comprehend. Everywhere I looked, I saw a world teeming with a health I no longer possessed. I watched a woman effortlessly lift her child into a car seat and felt a pang of jealousy for her pain-free movement. I heard a group of people laughing at a nearby cafe and resented the simple, unburdened joy in the sound. My world was now divided into two groups of people, the sick and the well. I was an unwilling immigrant in the land of the sick, and I didn't know the language or the customs. I just knew I wanted to go home, back to the person I used to be. The breaking point came not with a shout, but with a whisper. My partner found me curled on the sofa, laptop open to yet another terrifying medical article, tears silently streaming down my face. He wrapped his arms around me, the warmth of his embrace a stark contrast to the cold fear coiling in my gut. He didn't need to see the screen, he could see it in my eyes. "That's it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're seeing a doctor." The words were both a relief and a sentence. The time for pretending was over. The waiting room of the clinic felt like a sterile, beiged purgatory. The air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic, and the unspoken anxieties of the dozen or so strangers sitting around me. I filled out the clipboard of forms, trying to distill my amorphous, shifting pain into the neat little boxes and lines provided. How do you circle a number on a 1 to 10 scale for a pain that is sometimes a 3 and sometimes a 9? A pain that feels like a dull pressure 1 hour and a sharp stabbing the next. I felt like my complex, terrifying experience was being flattened into meaningless data before I even saw the doctor. I rehearsed my story in my head, a prosecutor preparing her opening statement. I wanted to sound rational, not hysterical. I needed to be clear and concise, not a rambling, anxious mess. The fear of being dismissed, of being told it was nothing, was almost as great as the fear of being told it was something terrible. I was about to hand over my vulnerability, my story, and my body to a complete stranger, and I prayed, with a desperation that surprised me, that he would handle them with care. I clutched my purse, my knuckles white, and waited for my name to be called. The room was filled with the sounds of quiet suffering. A man across from me coughed a deep, rattling cough. A young mother tried to soothe a whimpering child. The only other sound was the loud, methodical tick of a large clock on the wall, each second marking another moment of my anxious limbo. I felt completely anonymous, just another file in a cabinet, another name on a list. When the nurse finally called out a name that was a close approximation of mine, it only reinforced the feeling that I was just a piece of paperwork to be processed. I followed her down a long, white corridor that felt like a tunnel, the fluorescent lights above humming with an indifferent buzz. She took my weight and blood pressure with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and impersonal. Then she left me alone in the small examination room, the crinkle of the paper on the exam table the only sound. The room was cold, dominated by stainless steel instruments that gleamed under the harsh light. I sat on the edge of the table, my feet dangling above the floor, feeling small and exposed, like a child waiting for the principal. Dr. Martins entered without knocking, his hand outstretched for a brief, firm shake, while his eyes were already on the computer screen. He didn't sit down. He stood, scrolling, a man with no time to waste. So, he began, his tone brisk, abdominal pain. I launched into the story I had practiced, describing the onset, the quality of the pain, the fatigue, the fear. I watched his face for any sign of recognition or empathy, but his expression remained neutral, almost bored, as if he had heard this exact story 1,000 times before. He interrupted me, not with questions about the pain, but with a rapid-fire checklist: stress at work, high-pressure job, any history of anxiety, trouble sleeping. Each question felt like a leading one, designed not to uncover my truth but to confirm a pre-existing theory. I felt my carefully constructed case begin to crumble under his efficient dismissal. He wasn't listening to me. He was pattern matching, fitting my symptoms into the most convenient box. The hope that had carried me into this room began to wither. The physical exam was perfunctory, lasting less than 2 minutes. He pressed a few spots on my abdomen, listened to my chest with a cold stethoscope, and then stepped back, crossing his arms. The entire consultation, from his entrance to this moment, had taken less than 10 minutes. The paper on the exam table crinkled under me as I shifted, a sound that felt impossibly loud in the tense silence. His mouse clicked a few more times, the sound sharp and final, like a judge's gavel. He was done with his assessment. He finally turned his full attention to me, offering a smile that was all professionalism and no warmth. "Well, Anna," he said, his tone paternalistic, "based on your symptoms and your high-stress lifestyle, everything is pointing to one very common culprit." He leaned against the counter, the picture of calm authority. I held my breath, my heart pounding, caught between the terrifying hope for a simple answer and the crushing fear of being fundamentally misunderstood. His next words would set the course for the darkest period of my life. I looked at him, my mind a storm of medical anxieties, my body a landscape of real, tangible pain. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed confidence. "Look, Anna," he began, his tone condescendingly gentle, "you have a demanding career. You live in a busy city. It's a classic presentation of somatic symptom disorder. Your body is simply manifesting the stress and anxiety from your mind." He said it with such certainty, as if he had solved a simple puzzle. The diagnosis landed not as a relief, but as a profound humiliation. My pain, the unwelcome passenger that was dictating my life, had just been demoted to a figment of my overwrought imagination. It wasn't real. I was the problem. The months of fear, the sleepless nights, the struggle to get through a work date, was all just a mental failing. I felt my face flush with a hot, impotent anger. I wanted to scream, to argue, to list every agonizing symptom again, but the sheer force of his authority left me speechless. He was the doctor. He was the expert. He scribbled on his prescription pad and tore off the sheet with a flourish. "I'm giving you a prescription for a mild anti-inflammatory, but what you really need to do is manage your stress. Try yoga, download a meditation app, take a vacation." He handed me the slip of paper, his professional duty fulfilled. The consultation was over. He had neatly packaged my suffering, labeled it anxiety, and sent me on my way. I felt like a child who had been patted on the head and told not to fret. As I walked back down that long, white corridor, the paper in my hand felt both flimsy and incredibly heavy. It was a testament not to a diagnosis, but to a dismissal. The antiseptic smell of the clinic now seemed cloying, the smell of invalidation. In the car, I stared at his illegible signature on the prescription, and the tears I had been holding back finally came. They were hot tears of frustration and shame. My abdomen gave a painful throb, as if to mock his diagnosis, a stark reminder that this was far from over. For a few days, I tried. I really did. A desperate part of me wanted him to be right. It would be so much easier if the enemy was my own mind, something I could theoretically control. I filled the prescription, the pharmacist's cheerful instructions grating on my nerves. I downloaded the meditation app with the soothing voice and the gentle chimes. I unrolled a dusty yoga mat in my living room and tried to breathe deeply into my pain, just as the online instructor cheerfully advised. I tried to will myself into believing his simple, convenient truth. This effort was a strange form of self-gaslighting. I would feel a wave of pain and immediately tell myself it was just a physical manifestation of a stressful thought. I'd try to meditate it away, focusing on the disembodied voice telling me to observe my sensations without judgment. But judging them was the only sane response. These sensations were hostile invaders. This fragile hope felt like trying to build a dam out of sand. I was actively working to distrust my own body's clearest signals, and the cognitive dissonance was exhausting. The yoga was a particular kind of torture. As I twisted my body into poses meant to bring peace and alignment, the pain in my abdomen would sharpen, a hot poker reminding me of its reality. The scent of the lavender-scented candle I'd lit, meant to be calming, made me nauseous. The entire wellness industry, with its promises of mindful cures, suddenly felt like a cruel joke, a set of tools designed to convince people like me that our suffering was a choice, a failure of positive thinking. My body wasn't at peace. It was at war. The illusion shattered one evening mid-meditation. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, trying to focus on my breath, when a pain unlike any I had felt before ripped through me. It was a blinding, electric agony that made me gasp and curl into a ball on the floor. It was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was a loud, screaming siren from deep inside my body, drowning out the gentle chimes from my phone. In that moment, all denial was obliterated. Dr. Martens wasn't just wrong. His diagnosis was a dangerous fantasy. Determined, I booked a follow-up. I walked into his office not as a fearful patient but as a witness for the prosecution. I sat stiffly on the exam table and waited. When he entered, smiling that same placid smile, I began my report. I detailed the escalating pain, the failure of his prescribed treatment, and the new, crushing fatigue that had settled into my bones, a weariness so profound it felt like I was wading through wet cement. I presented the evidence of my body, praying he would finally see it. He listened with an air of patient indulgence, his head tilted slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It was the look of an adult listening to a child's fanciful tale. "Anna," he said when I finished, his voice dripping with condescension, "anxiety can be very powerful. It can mimic all sorts of serious symptoms. The fatigue you're feeling is classic. Your mind is exhausted from all this worrying." He wasn't hearing my words. He was filtering them through his unshakable initial diagnosis. My evidence was being dismissed as circumstantial. I tried one last time, my voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and fury. "This isn't just worrying," I said, leaning forward. "The pain is real. It's intense. Sometimes, it honestly feels like I'm dying from the inside out." And that's when he did it. He chuckled. It was a short, breathy sound, a laugh of pure, paternalistic dismissal. "Anna," he said, shaking his head slightly, "you're 35 and healthy. You are not dying. You are anxious. Let's talk about adjusting your anxiety medication." That laugh echoed in my ears long after I left his office. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, of a final judgment being passed. He hadn't just dismissed my symptoms. He had mocked my deepest fears. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot sickness in my stomach, that mingled with the pain already there. I walked out of the clinic in a daze, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. How do you fight for your life when the one person who is supposed to help you thinks it's all a joke? The battlefront soon shifted to my career. The fatigue was no longer a background hum. It was a lead blanket that suffocated my ambition and focus. I stared at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred into meaningless squiggles. Deadlines I used to meet with ease now loomed like impossible mountains. In a pivotal client meeting, while trying to explain a complex data set, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room swam, and I had to grip the edge of the polished mahogany table to keep from falling, my knuckles white against the dark wood. My boss, a man who had once praised my sharpness, called me into his glass-walled office. He closed the door, a gesture that was meant to convey privacy, but only amplified my sense of being trapped. He used words like concerned and performance, his gaze a mixture of pity and corporate impatience. He talked about the company's wellness resources and employee assistance programs. He was speaking the language of human resources. But what I heard was, "You are becoming a liability." The professional identity I had spent over a decade building was crumbling. I had always been reliable, Anna, sharp Anna, the one who got things done. Now, I was a question mark, a problem to be managed. The shame was immense. How could I explain that my body was in a state of civil war, especially when my own doctor believed the conflict was imaginary? The suggestion of a medical leave felt less like an offer of help and more like being quietly pushed onto an ice floe and set adrift. My carefully constructed life was being dismantled, piece by piece, by an invisible wrecking ball. The career I loved was slipping through my fingers. My energy, once a seemingly limitless resource, was now rationed out for only the most essential tasks, like showering and pretending to be okay. I was losing the war on all fronts, and the worst part was, I was fighting it completely alone, with no allies, no strategy, and a commander-in-chief who was convinced the enemy didn't even exist. The strain began to crack the foundations of my personal life. My partner tried to be supportive, but his patience was fraying. He would come home to find me on the sofa, too exhausted to have made dinner, and a flicker of disappointment would cross his face before he could mask it. He would ask, "Did you try that breathing exercise the doctor mentioned?" His attempts to help felt like small interrogations, his questions laced with the insidious suggestion that if I just tried harder, I could think my way out of this. Friendships withered from neglect. Invitations for dinners, for hikes, for movies would arrive via text, and I would stare at the cheerful messages, a wave of exhaustion washing over me at the mere thought of showering, dressing, and making conversation. I started replying with vague excuses, and soon, the invitations became less frequent. I was becoming a ghost in my own social circle, my absence a quiet testament to the illness no one could see or understand. I was an island, and the waters were rising. The isolation was the cruelest symptom of all. The pain was in my body, but the loneliness was in my soul. I was surrounded by people who loved me, yet I had never felt more alone. They saw a tired, irritable version of the woman they knew, but they couldn't see the relentless, internal battle that was consuming me. Their well-meaning advice, "You just need a good night's sleep. Maybe you should take a break from work," felt like tiny paper cuts, each one a small sting of misunderstanding. The final fracture happened during a quiet Tuesday night dinner. I had barely touched my food, the pain a tight knot in my stomach. My partner watched me, his frustration finally boiling over. "I just don't get it, Anna," he said, his voice rising. "We've seen the doctors. All the tests are normal. Are you sure this isn't all in your head?" The words, his words, the echo of Dr. Martin's condescension, hit me with the force of a physical blow. The last pillar of my support system had just crumbled into dust. Refusing to accept defeat, I dove headfirst into the medical labyrinth. I cashed in a portion of my retirement savings and became a professional patient, a collector of specialists. My first stop was a gastroenterologist, a kind but hurried woman who performed an endoscopy. She found mild inflammation, prescribed a powerful antacid, and sent me on my way. The pain, of course, continued unabated. She had found a clue, but not the culprit, and her interest waned when her first solution failed. Next was a neurologist, to investigate the dizziness and fatigue. This resulted in a brain MRI, an experience akin to being buried alive in a noisy, vibrating coffin. I lay perfectly still for 45 minutes, the machine's rhythmic clanging, a soundtrack to my frantic prayers. The result, a perfectly unremarkable brain scan. The neurologist suggested it could be a persistent migraine variant, but seemed unconvinced by his own theory. I left with another useless prescription and a growing sense of despair. The journey continued, each new specialist adding another layer of medical debt and another normal test result to my growing file of failures. A rheumatologist ran blood panels for every autoimmune disease imaginable. All came back negative. He listened to my story with weary resignation, the look of a man who had seen too many medically unexplainable patients. He was the one who finally delivered the system's verdict, leafing through my thick folder of normal results. "There's nothing organically wrong with you, Miss Martins," he said, his tone final. "Your blood work is pristine, your scans are clear. Sometimes, the body expresses stress in very physical ways. I strongly suggest you find a good therapist to work through these issues." It was the same diagnosis as Dr. Martin's, now validated by a gauntlet of specialists. The system had spoken. I was not sick, I was broken. It was the end of the line, and I was left standing there, in more pain than ever, holding a file full of proof that I was perfectly fine. Confined to my home, often to my bed, I returned to the internet. But my search was different now. I was no longer hunting for a diagnosis. I was hunting for echoes of my own story. I typed phrases into the search bar that I had been too ashamed to admit even to myself. Doctors don't believe my pain. Years of mysterious symptoms, told it's just anxiety. I clicked on obscure forums and decade-old blog posts, and there, in the digital ether, I found them. I found my people. It was a revelation. Story after story mirrored my own journey of dismissal and despair. A woman in Ohio with a mysterious nerve condition, a man in the United Kingdom with a rare vascular issue, all had been told they were stressed, depressed, or imagining it. Reading their words was like finding a freshwater spring in the middle of a desert. The tears that fell onto my keyboard were not of sadness, but of a fierce, validating relief. I was not crazy. I was not a medical mystery. I was just unheard. The digital glow of my tablet in the darkened room became a beacon, not a tormentor. For the first time in over a year, I didn't feel so alone. The weight of the medical gaslighting, the self-doubt that had become a corrosive acid in my soul, began to recede. Their stories gave me a new kind of strength, a righteous anger that burned away the fog of helpless despair. They had fought, they had persisted, and many of them had eventually found answers. Their survival became my blueprint for hope. In one of these forums, buried deep in a thread from 6 years ago, I found it. A woman described a constellation of symptoms so uncannily similar to mine that my breath caught in my chest. She wrote about the shifting abdominal pain, the crushing fatigue, and the legion of specialists who had dismissed her. Then she mentioned a name, a young, tenacious doctor at a university research hospital named Sophia Reyes, the only one who had taken the time to connect the dots. The post was ancient, but the name was a lifeline. With a surge of adrenaline that felt foreign after months of fatigue, I found my phone. My hands trembled as I searched for Dr. Sophia Reyes. My heart sank when I saw she was now a specialist at a major research center with a notoriously long waitlist, but I had to try. I dialed the number, my voice a dry croak when the receptionist answered. I stumbled through a condensed version of my year-long nightmare, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I was begging, and I didn't care. I expected a polite, bureaucratic refusal, a 6-month wait, a referral that I didn't have. I braced myself for the click of the phone, for the final door to be slammed in my face. The receptionist was silent for a moment, and in that silence, I held my breath. I could hear the distant, sanitized sounds of a clinic in the background, a world of healing that felt a million miles away. My entire future seemed to hang on the next words from this complete stranger. "You know," she said, her tone shifting from professional to something softer, something human, "we just had a cancellation for tomorrow morning at 10. It's a long shot, but if you can make it, the appointment is yours." The offer was so sudden, so unexpected, it felt like a glitch in the matrix of my misfortune. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through my cynicism. I scribbled down the details, my hand shaking so badly the address was barely legible. Tomorrow. It wasn't a vague point in the future, it was a concrete destination. As I hung up the phone, a new kind of fear bloomed, the fear of hope itself. I had been disappointed so many times, my optimism crushed under the weight of medical indifference. To let myself believe again felt like a reckless gamble. To place my trust in one more doctor felt like willingly walking into the path of a storm. What if she was just another wall of dismissal in a slightly different office? The next morning, I prepared for the appointment like a soldier preparing for battle. I meticulously organized my file of normal test results, a monument to my frustrating journey. I wrote out a detailed timeline of my symptoms, complete with dates and pain levels, determined not to miss a single detail. I chose my outfit with care, wanting to look put together, credible, not like the desperate, broken person I felt inside. Every action was a defense mechanism, a shield against the potential for more hurt. My cynicism was a constant, whispering companion. "Don't get your hopes up. You've been here before. She'll run the same tests and tell you the same things." I was building an emotional fortress around my heart, preparing for the inevitable blow of being misunderstood one last time. Hope felt like a dangerous vulnerability, an exposed flank that I was terrified to reveal. I drove to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind a war zone between this desperate hope and my battle-scarred experience. The university hospital was a sprawling, intimidating complex of glass and steel, a city dedicated to medicine. The waiting room was different from the others. It was filled with people whose illnesses were complex and visible, patients with stories written on their bodies. I felt like an imposter with my invisible ailment, my file of perfect health. I shrank into my chair, feeling smaller and more insignificant than ever, convinced this had all been a terrible mistake. Then the door opened, and a young woman in a white coat called my name, pronouncing it correctly. Dr. Sophia Reyes was not what I expected. She was young, with kind, intelligent eyes that held no trace of hurry or fatigue. She led me to her office, not an exam room, and gestured for me to sit in a comfortable chair opposite her desk. The first thing I noticed was that she didn't open my file or turn on her computer. She just sat down, leaned forward, and looked directly at me. She picked up a pen and a blank notepad. "Anna," she said, her voice calm and direct, "I've seen the referral notes, but I want to hear it from you. Forget the medical jargon. Forget the test results for a moment. Just tell me your story. Start from the very last day you remember feeling perfectly normal." The question was so simple, so profoundly human, that it disarmed me completely. No one had ever asked me to tell my story. They had only asked for a list of symptoms. For the first time in over a year, I felt seen. Not as a collection of data points, not as a diagnostic puzzle, but as a person whose experience mattered. The emotional fortress I had so carefully constructed crumbled to dust. I started talking, and the words poured out the first subtle pain, the escalating fear, the dismissals, the condescending laugh, the broken relationships, the profound loneliness. I spoke for nearly an hour, and she never once interrupted. She just listened, her pen occasionally moving across the page. The act of being heard without judgment was a form of medicine in itself. Her attentive silence was a balm on the raw wound of my invalidation. For the first time, I wasn't editing my story to sound more credible or less anxious. I was giving her the unvarnished truth, and she was receiving it with a quiet, focused respect that felt like a lifeline. The room was warm and safe, a sanctuary from the cold indifference of the medical world I had come to know. When I finally fell silent, emotionally spent, she didn't offer a quick diagnosis. She looked down at her notes for a long moment, a thoughtful frown on her face. Then she looked up, her gaze steady and serious. "I have a theory," she said slowly. "It's a bit of a long shot, something rare, that wouldn't show up on any of the tests you've had so far, but your story fits. We would need to do a very specific kind of scan to confirm it. A theory, a plan." It was more than I had dared to hope for. She pulled out a medical diagram and began to explain. Her hypothesis was a rare vascular compression syndrome, a condition where a major artery was being squeezed, causing intermittent blood flow restriction to my digestive system. She explained how this could create the migrating pain, the profound fatigue, the dizziness, every single one of my anxious symptoms. She was giving my pain a name, a logic, a physical home within my body. She was telling me, with science and with empathy, that I was not crazy. The relief was so immense, so total, that it felt like a physical event. It was a dam breaking, a pressure valve releasing a year's worth of stored-up fear and frustration and self-doubt. The tears that came were not of pain, but of a catharsis so profound it shook my entire body. She believed me, and she had a plan. She handed me a tissue and a bottle of water, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. Her validation was more potent than any drug. "Your pain is real, Anna," she said gently. And those 5 words were the most healing thing I had heard from a medical professional. "What you have been feeling is ischemic pain. It's the same kind of pain people feel when they're having a heart attack. It's severe. You haven't been exaggerating." She had not only diagnosed a potential illness, she had retroactively healed the trauma of being disbelieved. She handed me a request for a specialized type of angiogram, a procedure that would map the blood vessels in my abdomen. It was a tangible object, a piece of paper that represented not a dismissal, but a real investigation. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The journey of misunderstanding was finally over. Now, the journey toward a diagnosis and a fight for my life was about to begin. The day before the angiogram was a strange landscape of controlled anxiety. I had to fast after midnight, a simple instruction that felt monumental, the first concrete step in a new, serious chapter. I spent the evening rereading the hospital pamphlet about the procedure, my eyes tracing the diagrams of catheters and arteries, my mind snagging on the list of potential risks. My partner was a quiet, steady presence, his guilt from our argument replaced by a fierce, protective support. He made me tea I couldn't drink and sat with me in a silence that was comforting, not tense. The fear was a low hum beneath the surface. a constant companion, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the nebulous, free-floating terror of the unknown. This was a focused fear, a fear with a purpose. My biggest anxiety was no longer that they would find nothing. It was that they would find nothing and Dr. Reyes would be proven wrong, sending me back to square one, the land of the medically unexplained. I was terrified of losing this newfound hope, this one doctor who believed me. The night was long and sleepless, my empty stomach a hollow echo of my anxious anticipation. I watched the numbers on the clock change, each minute bringing me closer to a potential truth. There was no turning back. I was on a precipice, and the world on the other side would be different, regardless of the outcome. Either I would have a diagnosis and a battle to fight, or I would have my last hope extinguished. Both possibilities felt equally terrifying. The alarm at 5 a.m. felt like a starting gun. At the hospital, the preparations moved with a calm efficiency that both soothed and unnerved me. A nurse with kind hands inserted an IV, the small prick a tangible anchor to the reality of the moment. I changed into a thin, paper-like gown and was wheeled into the angiography suite. It was a cold, dark room, dominated by a massive C-shaped machine that loomed over a narrow table. Dr. Reyes was there, a reassuring presence amidst the intimidating technology. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze. "We're going to get some answers today," she said. Lying on the cold table, I surrendered. I gave my body over to the machine and the experts, my fight for validation complete. Now, my role was to be still, to be a vessel for the investigation. I felt the sting of the local anesthetic in my groin, then a strange pressure as the radiologist threaded the catheter into my artery. A warm, flushing sensation spread through my body as the contrast dye was injected. A bizarre internal heat. On the monitors above, the ghostly, black-and-white roadmap of my own blood vessels began to appear. I watched the screens, unable to decipher the alien landscape of my own insides. The radiologist and Dr. Reyes leaned in close to one of the monitors, their bodies tense with concentration. They murmured to each other in the clipped, technical language of medicine. I saw Dr. Reyes point to a specific spot on the screen. The radiologist zoomed in, and their quiet murmuring stopped. There was a moment of absolute silence in the room, a silence that felt heavier and more significant than all the noise of the machine. The procedure ended, and I was wheeled to a recovery bay. A nurse instructed me to lie flat for the next 4 hours to prevent bleeding from the puncture site. She checked my vital signs, adjusted my pillows, and then left me alone behind a thin curtain. Dr. Reyes had told me she would come to speak with me as soon as she and the radiologist had finished their formal review of the images, and so, I waited. The silence, which had been a relief, now became a vessel for my anxiety. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside my bed was the only soundtrack to my frantic thoughts. I replayed the moment of silence in the procedure room over and over. What did it mean? Was it the silence of discovering something definitive, or the silence of realizing it was another dead end? My mind created elaborate narratives for both scenarios. Each footstep I heard in the hallway made my heart leap, only to sink again as it passed my curtain. The ceiling was a blank, white canvas, onto which I projected all my fears. I was suspended in a state of pure uncertainty, my entire life's trajectory hanging on the words of a doctor I had met only once. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a passive agony that was somehow worse than the physical pain I had endured. It was the final, terrible limbo before the verdict. Then, I heard the soft squeak of shoes stopping outside my bay, and the curtain was pulled back. It was Dr. Reyes. She held a tablet in her hands, her expression serious but calm. She sat on the stool next to my bed, her presence filling the small space. "We found it, Anna," she said, her voice quiet but certain. She turned the tablet so I could see the screen. It was an image from the angiogram, a complex web of black lines against a gray background. She pointed to one specific artery. "Right here," she said, and I saw it. A distinct, undeniable bulge, a dangerous weakening in the vessel wall, a rare, slow-growing aneurysm. There it was, the ghost that had haunted me for over a year, now captured in a single, damning image. It was real. The pain was real. The fatigue was real. I stared at that dark spot on the screen, the visual proof of my suffering, and a wave of emotion so powerful it stole my breath washed over me. It was validation in its purest form. It was the end of a long, lonely war against an enemy no one else could see. So, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I wasn't crazy. The tears came then, hot and immediate, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Dr. Reyes just sat with me, letting the moment happen. She understood that this was more than a diagnosis. It was a restoration of my sanity, a reclamation of my truth. That small, dark anomaly on the screen was the villain of my story, a concrete enemy I could finally face. It had a location, it had a shape, and soon, I would learn, it had a name. The relief, however, was quickly followed by a new, colder emotion, fear, an aneurysm. I knew what that word meant. Dr. Reyes's next words confirmed my unspoken terror. This is a serious condition, Anna, she said, her tone shifting from validating to clinical. It's called a superior mesenteric artery aneurysm. It's what's been causing your pain. The danger is that if it continues to grow, it can rupture, and a rupture in that location. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Is a catastrophic, often fatal event. Dr. Reyes explained the path forward with calm clarity. The only treatment was a complex and high-risk open surgery to repair the damaged artery. She talked about the top vascular surgeon at the hospital, about recovery times, about potential complications. The medical jargon that had once been a barrier now felt like a battle plan. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer the shapeless dread of the unknown. It was the focused fear of a soldier who has just been shown the enemy on a map. I asked questions, my voice surprisingly steady. I wanted to know everything's success rates, surgical techniques, what to expect. For the first time, my questions were being met with direct, honest answers, instead of placating smiles. I was no longer a hysterical woman with anxiety. I was a partner in my own healthcare, a person with a life-threatening condition, who was preparing for a fight. The gratitude I felt for Dr. Reyes was immense. She had not only found my illness, she had given me back my agency to schedule the urgent surgery. The hospital's protocol required a full transfer of all my prior medical records, including the detailed notes from Dr. Martins. Dr. Reyes's team initiated the request, a standard piece of administrative bureaucracy. None of us could have known that this simple, procedural step would trigger a bizarre and consequential error deep within the hospital's digital infrastructure. An unseen clock had just started ticking. In a drab, basement office elsewhere in the hospital, an administrative clerk was working through a monotonous queue of digital tasks. On his screen were two notifications. One was the file transfer request for Anna Martins, the other was a mortality notification for a different patient, an elderly woman named Anna Martins who had passed away in the palliative care wing that morning. Distracted, overworked, thinking only of his lunch break, the clerk's fingers flew across the keyboard. He processed the wrong file. A few clicks, a confirmation box, and just like that, in the cold, binary world of the hospital's central database, my official status was changed. A bright red flag was attached to my digital file, a single, stark word that overrode my entire existence: deceased. It was a simple, human error, a slip of the finger, with no malice behind it. But this ghost in the machine had just set the stage for the most surreal chapter of my journey. Later that afternoon, Dr. Reyes was in the hospital cafeteria, grabbing a much-needed coffee. She ran into an older colleague, a senior physician from the internal medicine department. He asked her about any interesting cases, and she described mine, the rare aneurysm masquerading for a year as a psychological issue. She spoke passionately about the dangers of diagnostic bias, of not listening to patients, using my case as a cautionary tale, without ever mentioning Dr. Martins by name. The older physician listened intently, a frown creasing his forehead. The details of the story, the persistent but vague abdominal pain, the clean test results, the diagnosis of anxiety in a high-achieving young woman, sounded eerily familiar. "That's an incredible catch," he said, stirring his coffee. "You know, it reminds me of a patient a colleague of mine was complaining about a few months back, a difficult case with almost identical symptoms. His name was Martins." The seed of doubt was planted. Later that day, the colleague found Dr. Martins between appointments. He brought up the conversation casually, a piece of interesting medical gossip, heard a wild story from Sophia Reyes in vascular. He began, "Young woman, year of abdominal pain. Everyone thought it was anxiety. Turns out it's a rare SMA aneurysm. Sounds a lot like that patient you told me about. What was her name again? Dr. Martins felt a prickle of unease. Anna, I think, he said dismissively. A classic somatizer. But the seed had taken root. The coincidence was too specific, too neat. A cold dread, an emotion he was unaccustomed to, began to creep up his spine. Could he have missed something so significant? His professional pride, his entire sense of self, was built on the foundation of his diagnostic certainty. The thought that he could have made such a catastrophic error was unthinkable, but it was there, a small, insistent whisper in the back of his mind. To silence it, he decided to look up my file, just to prove himself right. Back in his quiet, orderly office, Dr. Martin sat down at his desk. The unease from his colleague's story was an irritating splinter in his mind, a dissonance he needed to resolve. This would only take a moment. He would look up my file, see his own clear, concise notes about somatization, and reaffirm his correct judgment. It was a simple act of professional housekeeping. He typed my name, Anna Martins, into the hospital's central database, and hit enter, expecting to feel the familiar satisfaction of being proven right. The profile loaded instantly, but it was not what he expected. It was framed by a thick, crimson banner, a digital gash across the top of the screen. Inside the banner, in stark, white, capital letters, was a single word, deceased. The word hung in the airless space of his office, seeming to suck all the oxygen from the room. He blinked. He refreshed the page. The red banner remained, an unblinking, accusatory eye. It couldn't be real. It was a system glitch, a typo. It had to be. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The memory of my face, earnest and pleading, flashed in his mind. Then, the memory of his own voice, so confident and dismissive, and worst of all, the sound of his own laugh, the short, sharp chuckle that had sealed my dismissal. In the sterile silence of his office, that laugh echoed back at him, no longer a sound of professional authority, but a monstrous, damning noise. What if my pain had been real? What if his arrogance had, in fact, killed me? His hands, usually so steady during delicate procedures, trembled as he reached for the phone. He felt a wave of nausea, a physical reaction to the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what this red banner implied. The world he had built, a world of diagnostic certainty and professional respect, was tilting violently on its axis. He was no longer a respected physician. He was a man staring into an abyss of his own making, and at the bottom of it was a patient he had laughed at. His first call was to medical records. His voice was strained, unnatural, as he asked the clerk to confirm my status. The voice on the other end was bored, bureaucratic. Let's see, Martins, Anna, ... Yes, sir. The file is flagged as deceased. Dr. Martins's heart hammered against his ribs. Is there a cause of death listed, a date? The clerk sighed, the sound of a man bothered by details. Sir, I just have the status. I don't have the coroner's report. The line went dead, leaving him with a confirmation that explained nothing. A frantic, desperate thought pierced through his panic. The aneurysm, his colleague's story. It was a wild, improbable chance, but it was the only thread he had. He fumbled through the hospital directory, his fingers slipping on the phone's keypad, and dialed the number for Dr. Reyes's department. He didn't know what he was going to ask. He just needed to know if the story was connected. A nurse answered, her voice calm and professional. He could barely get the words out. I'm calling about a patient, he stammered, Anna Martins. She was referred to Dr. Reyes. He braced himself for the worst, for the nurse to tell him that I had died on their operating table, that they had found the aneurysm too late. He expected a story of a tragic medical case. He was not prepared for the nurse's cheerful, completely bewildering response. Oh yes, Anna, she said. She's doing well. She just got moved from recovery to a room on the 4th floor. Why do you ask? The whiplash was staggering. Alive. I was alive. The crushing weight of having killed me lifted, replaced by a dizzying, disorienting relief. But that relief was immediately crushed by a second, equally horrifying realization. The aneurysm was real. My pain was real, which meant his diagnosis wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of medicine, of empathy, of his most basic duty as a physician. He hadn't killed me with a clerical error, but he had come terrifyingly close to killing me with his own arrogance. He walked to Dr. Reyes's office in a daze, his feet moving on autopilot. He was a ghost haunting the hallways of his own hospital. He found her reviewing scans on a large, high-definition monitor. He didn't bother with pleasantries. The carefully constructed facade of the confident doctor had been completely stripped away. I was her previous physician, he said, his voice hollow. Anna Martins, can I see what you found? Dr. Reyes looked at his pale, stricken face, understood, and simply nodded, pointing to the screen. He stared at the image. The angiography was stark and clear, a map of my internal reality, and there it was, the undeniable, obscene bulge in the artery wall. It was not a shadow. It was not a ghost of anxiety. It was a lethal time bomb, ticking away inside the body of a woman he had told to try yoga. The image on the screen was his judgment, an irrefutable, black-and-white testament to his failure. Everything I had tried to tell him was right there, in that one dark spot. He saw it all in that moment, my desperate eyes, his own dismissive wave of the hand, the prescription for a useless anti-inflammatory. Every interaction, every word, was replayed in his mind, now cast in the horrifying glow of this new truth. His certainty had been a form of blindness. His experience had been a fortress that had prevented him from seeing the terrified person right in front of him. He was not just wrong, he had been cruel. Dr. Reyes watched him, her silence more powerful than any accusation. She simply allowed him to confront the evidence. After a long, heavy moment, she asked the question that hung in the air between them, her tone gentle but unwavering. You were the one who diagnosed her with anxiety, weren't you? The question was not an attack, but an invitation to accountability. It was his chance to own the truth he was seeing on the screen. He sank into a nearby chair, the strength gone from his legs. Yes, he whispered, the single word, a confession. I told her it was all in her head. I laughed at her. Saying it out loud made it real, solidifying the shame that was churning in his gut. He then told her everything, the story of the file, the red deceased banner, the sickening, soul-freezing moment when he believed his negligence had led to my death. It was a painful, humiliating exorcism of his own pride. He didn't look for pity or for forgiveness. He was a man confessing his sins to the one person who truly understood the gravity of his transgression. He had failed on every level, as a scientist, as a diagnostician, and most profoundly, as a human being. The confession left him empty, a hollowed-out version of the man he had been just an hour before. The pillar of his professional identity had crumbled into dust. Dr. Reyes listened to his entire rambling confession without a word of judgment. When he was finished, a broken man in her office, she didn't offer empty platitudes, she offered him a path forward. Her surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, she said, her voice all business now. It's extremely high risk. The surgeon needs every piece of information he can get. Your old notes, your memory of her case, could be useful. You can sit in the observation room, you can help. He had been confronted, he had confessed. He did not expect redemption, but she was offering him a chance at utility, a chance to use his mistake to contribute, in some small way, to saving the life he had so carelessly endangered. He nodded, unable to speak, clinging to this one small, practical task. It wouldn't erase his failure, but it was the first step out of the abyss. While my doctor was having his soul dismantled, I was being prepared for battle. The evening before the surgery was a blur of antiseptic smells and quiet, purposeful activity. I signed consent forms, the legal language a stark reminder of the risks I was about to take. The vascular surgeon, a man with calm eyes and incredibly steady hands, came to speak with me. He explained the procedure without condescension, treating me like an intelligent partner in the process. His confidence was a small, warm light in the darkness of my fear. My partner sat by my bedside, his hand holding mine, his presence a silent, unwavering anchor. We didn't talk much. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the quiet moments of the past few days. His fear was a mirror of my own, but his strength gave me strength. I was not alone in this fight. As the nurse came in to administer the first sedative, a deep sense of peace settled over me. I had fought so hard just to get here, to this moment of terrifying hope. I was ready. Just before the sedative began to pull me under, the evening nurse was checking my chart. She looked up and said casually, "It's good that Dr. Martins is consulting. He's been on the phone with the surgical team all afternoon, going over your early history." The name was a jolt, a discordant note in the calm, preoperative atmosphere. Dr. Martins, the man who laughed at me. Why on earth would he be involved now? The question floated in the fog of my mind as the world began to soften and drift away. The next hours were a void for me, but a lifetime for those who waited. In the surgical waiting room, my partner sat, staring at a clock on the wall, each tick a small hammer blow to his nerves. He was trapped in a loop of his own regrets, the memory of his angry, doubting words playing over and over. He prayed for a chance to take them back, to tell me he was sorry, to have a future where he could spend the rest of his life believing me. Miles away, it seemed, in a darkened observation room, above the operating theater, Dr. Martens watched the surgery unfold on a large monitor. He was a spectator at his own trial. Every precise movement of the surgeon's hands, every beep and whir of the monitors, was a testament to the reality he had denied. He watched as they carefully clamped the artery, the vessel that held my life in the balance. He stood for 6 straight hours, a silent, guilt-ridden vigil, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. When the surgeon finally looked up from his work, stripping off his gloves, Dr. Martens felt his knees buckle. The surgeon's face was tired but calm. He walked out to the waiting room and told my partner the news. The aneurysm had been successfully repaired. The surgery was a success. But the next 48 hours would be critical. The battle was won, but the war for my recovery was just beginning. My first sensation was of floating in a thick, gray fog. Then, a rhythmic, mechanical whoosh, the sound of a ventilator breathing for me. Muted beeps from unseen machines. A dull, aching pain across my abdomen. A pain that was sharp and sore, but different. The old pain, the deep, gnawing, phantom pain that had been my constant companion for a year, was gone. Its absence was a silence so profound it was almost a sound in itself. My eyelids fluttered open. The bright lights of the intensive care unit were a painful blur. I tried to focus, and the first thing that came into view was a face, my partner's face, etched with exhaustion, relief, and a love so profound it seemed to fill the entire room. He was crying, silent tears tracing paths through the stubble on his cheeks. I was alive. I had survived. I tried to speak, but the tube in my throat stopped me. So instead, I squeezed his hand. The next 2 days were a slow, painful climb back to the world. The ICU was a place outside of time, measured not in hours but in small victories. The moment the breathing tube was removed, and I took my first raw, painful breath on my own, the first spoonful of ice chips, a cool miracle on my parched tongue. The first time I managed to sit up, the room spinning as nurses held me steady. Each step was a monumental effort, a reclaiming of my own body. Dr. Reyes visited every day, her calm presence a constant reassurance. During one visit, as I was starting to feel more human, she mentioned something that snagged in my recovering mind. "You know," she said, checking my chart, "it's a good thing we had Dr. Martens's old notes." There was an unusual vein pattern near the aneurysm he had documented but dismissed as irrelevant. It turned out to be critical for the surgeon to know about. He may have made a bad call initially, but he helped us in the end. The puzzle of his involvement deepened. After 4 days, I graduated from the ICU to a regular hospital room. This was when the real work and the real pain began. The pain of the illness was gone, but the pain of healing was a brutal new reality. The first time the physical therapist came to get me out of bed, I learned the true meaning of agony. The long, vertical incision felt like it was being ripped apart with every move. Just standing up for 30 seconds left me drenched in sweat, shaking, and nauseous. I had survived a brush with death, only to be defeated by a 5-foot walk to the bathroom. The frustration was immense. My mind was ready to live again, but my body was a broken, battered vessel. There were days when I despaired, when the pain seemed insurmountable, when I wept with sheer exhaustion. But then I would remember the old pain, the hopeless, invisible pain, and I knew this was different. This was productive pain. This was the agony of my body knitting itself back together. This was the price of my life. One afternoon, a nurse brought in a small, plain envelope that had been left at the front desk. Inside was a simple white card. The note was brief, written in a doctor's hurried scrawl, wishing you a complete and swift recovery. It was signed, simply, Dr. Martens. There was no apology, no explanation, just that simple, formal sentence. I stared at the card, a storm of conflicting emotions brewing inside me. Was this an act of cowardice? Or was it the only thing a man so thoroughly humbled knew how to say? As my body slowly healed, my mind began to process the trauma. The 10-inch scar bisecting my abdomen was the visible proof of my journey, a pale, puckered line that was already fading. But the invisible scars, the ones left by months of being disbelieved and dismissed, were deeper and angrier. I had flashbacks, not of the surgery, but of Dr. Martens's laugh, of my partner's doubting eyes, of the crushing loneliness of my illness. The medical gaslighting had left a profound wound on my psyche. The hospital provided a therapist, a woman with a gentle voice and wise eyes. In our sessions, a year's worth of suppressed rage came pouring out. I was angry at the arrogance of the medical system, angry at the people who had doubted me, and even angry at myself for ever allowing that doubt to take root in my own mind. I learned that my experience had a name: medical trauma. And I learned that healing the mind was just as critical as healing the body. During one session, my therapist suggested something that both terrified and intrigued me. "You may want to consider meeting with him," she said softly, "with Dr. Martens, not for his sake, but for yours. To close the loop, to say what you need to say, so that you are no longer carrying the weight of what was done to you." The thought of facing him again sent a jolt of fear through me, but it was followed by a flicker of something else: power. The power to write the final chapter of this story myself. The day of my discharge was bright and sunny, a perfect, beautiful day for a rebirth. Leaving the hospital felt like being released from prison. The air outside tasted sweet. The colors of the world seemed impossibly vibrant. My partner helped me into the car, his movements slow and careful, his face beaming with a joy that mirrored my own. I was fragile, I was sore, but I was going home. I was alive, and the whole world felt new. As we drove towards the main exit of the hospital campus, we had to pass by the medical office building where it had all started. On the 3rd floor, I could see the window that I knew belonged to his office. The scene of my greatest humiliation. My partner's hand found mine and squeezed. I looked at the window, and for a moment, I considered the therapist's suggestion. Then I shook my head and looked forward, at the road ahead. Not yet. For now, it was enough to just be going home. The first weeks at home were a study in slowness. My life, once a frantic race, was now a deliberate, careful walk. Every act was an achievement: climbing the stairs to my bedroom, making myself a cup of tea, walking with my dog to the end of the block and back. I rediscovered the simple, profound pleasure of things I had once taken for granted: the taste of real food, the comfort of my own bed, the warmth of the sun on my face as I sat on my porch. My new normal was quieter, more thoughtful. The relentless ambition that had once driven me had been replaced by a deep, abiding gratitude for the simple fact of my existence. I was a different person, forged in a fire I never would have chosen. I was scarred, yes, but the scars were a part of me now, a testament to my resilience. Then, one day, a thick envelope arrived from the hospital's administrative office. It was a formal letter of apology. The letter was carefully worded, full of corporate speak about lapses in our diagnostic process and a commitment to ongoing physician education. It mentioned that an internal review of my case had been completed, and that the physician involved, it never used his name, had undergone remedial training and oversight. It was the system's way of closing the file, a sterile, impersonal apology for nearly letting me die. It was something, I supposed, but I knew my story with him wasn't truly over yet. To make sense of the chaos, I began to write. At first it was just for me, a private journal to map the tangled wilderness of my trauma. I wrote about the pain, the fear, and the profound loneliness of being disbelieved. But the more I wrote, the more I realized my story wasn't just my own. It was the story of countless others trapped in the gray spaces of the medical system. With a trembling finger, I created a blog and published my first post. I sent my story out into the void, expecting nothing. The response was a tidal wave. It started with a few comments, then dozens, then hundreds. Messages flooded my inbox from people all over the world, each one a heartbreaking echo of my own experience. They were teachers, lawyers, construction workers, parents, all of them fighting invisible battles, all of them having been told, in one way or another, that their suffering was not real. My personal journal had become a public square, a gathering place for the medically unheard. In this newfound community, I discovered a purpose beyond my own survival. My pain, once a source of isolation, was now a bridge connecting me to others. The helplessness that had defined my year-long ordeal began to transform into a powerful sense of advocacy. I was no longer just a survivor, I was a witness. Each story shared in my comments section was a testament to a systemic problem, and I felt a growing responsibility to amplify our collective voice. One evening, a comment appeared that was different from the others. It was anonymous, but the language was precise, clinical. "Your story is now being used as a case study in grand rounds at our hospital," it read. "You are teaching a generation of new doctors what it means to listen. Thank you." I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, who was connected to that message. It was a sign. The system was learning, and it made me realize I had one last piece of unfinished business. The therapist's words came back to me, no longer sounding terrifying, but necessary. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. It was about standing in the room where I had been made to feel small and powerless, and reclaiming that space. I found the number for his office. When the receptionist answered, my voice was not the weak, pleading whisper of a desperate patient. It was calm, clear, and firm. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with Dr. Martins," I said. "My name is Anna Martins." I expected a refusal, a polite deflection through his nurse, an excuse that he was too busy. The receptionist put me on hold, and in the silence, I rehearsed the words I wanted to say. I wasn't planning a confrontation, but a declaration of my reality, my survival, and the human cost of his failure to listen. I was not asking for anything from him, not an apology, not an explanation. I was simply going to close the circle on my own terms. The receptionist came back on the line, her voice slightly surprised. "He can see you at the end of his day on Friday. Would 5 p.m. work for you?" He had agreed. The reality of it settled in, a heavy, solid thing. The meeting was set. For the next 2 days, I felt a strange calm. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. I was no longer the patient coming to him for answers. I was the survivor coming to him with the truth. This time, when I walked down the long, white corridor, it did not feel like a tunnel of judgment. It was just a hallway. When I entered his office, the scene was completely different. The room was the same, but the power dynamic had been inverted. He wasn't behind the imposing fortress of his desk. He was sitting in one of the patient chairs, the one I had sat in, and he stood up when I entered. He looked older, smaller, the arrogance gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. The air was thick with everything unsaid between us. I did not feel the rage I had anticipated. Looking at him, I saw not a monster, but a fallible man, who had been confronted with the devastating consequences of his own pride. I sat in the other chair, and we faced each other as equals for the first time. My presence in that room, healthy and whole, was a louder statement than any words I could have spoken. The silence stretched, and I let it, knowing it was his to break. He finally looked at me, his gaze direct and filled with a shame that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "Anna," he began, his voice low and raspy, "there is nothing I can say that can undo the harm I caused you. No apology is adequate, but I need you to know, I am sorry. You taught me a terrible and necessary lesson, a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. You have changed the way I practice medicine." I listened. I let his apology settle in the space between us. I saw the truth of it in his eyes. And then, I spoke. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply told him my story from my side of the exam table. I told him about the sleepless nights, about the fear of losing my mind, about the relationships that frayed, about the profound loneliness. I explained the human cost of his 5-minute diagnosis, the ripple effect of his casual dismissal. I was not there to grant him absolution. I was there to make him bear witness to the full weight of his mistake. When I finished, I felt a sense of release, as if I had finally set down a heavy burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I had spoken my truth to the one person who needed to hear it most. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice even, "but I am choosing to move on. I hope you use what you've learned to believe the next patient who sits in that chair." I stood up. The meeting concluded. I had taken back my power. I had written my own ending. As I walked out of his office for the last time, I didn't look back. The chapter was closed. I was no longer defined by his disbelief or by my illness. I was defined by my survival and by the new path that was unfolding before me, the path of a patient who had found her voice and was determined to use it to help others. 6 months later, I stood on a brightly lit stage, a microphone in my hand, looking out at a sea of young, eager faces. I was the keynote speaker at a medical school conference on patient-centered care. I told them my story, all of it. I spoke about the subtle tyranny of diagnostic bias, the sacred importance of listening, and the courage it takes for a patient to say, "I am in pain." I urged them to see the person behind the chart, to treat the story, not just the symptom. As I spoke, I felt a new kind of energy, the thrill of turning my trauma into a tool for change. These were the future doctors, the future Dr. Martenses and Dr. Raises of the world. If my story could plant a seed of empathy in even one of them, if it could prevent one future patient from enduring what I had then, my suffering would be redeemed, given a meaning I never could have imagined in my darkest days. I was no longer a victim of the system. I was becoming a part of its immune response. In the back row of the auditorium, half hidden in the shadows, a man sat alone, listening to every word. It was Dr. Martens. He wasn't there for recognition or to be seen. He was there to learn. He watched the woman he had dismissed as hysterical hold an auditorium of future physicians captive with her strength and her wisdom. He was bearing witness, continuing to learn the lesson she was now teaching to the world. My life found a new, gentler rhythm. The scar on my abdomen faded from an angry red to a pale, silvery line, a permanent reminder not of what I had lost, but of what I had survived. It was a map of my journey, a mark of my resilience. I returned to my work, but with new boundaries. I ran in the park, but now I ran for the joy of movement, not to race against a clock. I had been given a second chance at life, and I was determined to live it with gratitude and intention. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was from a young woman who had been in the audience at the medical school conference. "I was on the verge of quitting," she wrote. "I was becoming cynical. Your story reminded me why I wanted to become a doctor in the first place. I've just applied for a residency in complex diagnostics. Thank you." I looked at her message, and I smiled. The ripple effect had begun. In a hospital across town, Dr. Martens sits with a new patient, a young man with a confusing array of symptoms and a folder full of normal test results. The old Dr. Martens would have had him diagnosed and out the door in 7 minutes. But this Dr. Martens is different. He puts down his pen, turns away from his computer screen, and leans forward, making direct eye contact. "Okay," he says, his voice quiet and patient. "Let's forget the charts for a minute. Tell me your story." The young man hesitates, clearly expecting to be rushed. Dr. Martens waits. Finally, the young man begins to talk, and Dr. Martens listens. He listens to the fears behind the symptoms, the details between the lines. When the patient is finished, looking scared and vulnerable, Dr. Martens gives him a nod. "I don't know what's wrong yet," he says honestly, "but we are going to figure it out, together. I believe you." 1 year to the day after my surgery, my home is filled with the sound of laughter. My friends and my partner surround me as I lean over a birthday cake, its candles blazing. It feels like more than a birthday. It's an anniversary of my second life. As I look at the faces of the people I love, illuminated by the warm candlelight, a profound sense of peace settles over me. The journey was a descent into hell, but it brought me back with a wisdom and a gratitude I never would have known. I make a silent wish, not for anything I want, but in thanks for everything I have. And then, I take a deep breath and blow out the flames. My journey taught me the most fundamental lesson. You are the foremost expert on your own body. Pain is a messenger, not a weakness, and it is a message that deserves to be heard. If you feel that something is wrong, do not let anyone, no matter how confident or credentialed, convince you that it is all in your head. Fight for answers, demand to be seen. Your story is valid, your experience is real, and your life is worth the fight. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe and share. Together, we can make sure every patient's voice is heard.